The African Deep Dive podcast is brought to you by the African Technology Policy Studies Network. This podcast explores how science, technology, and innovation can drive sustainable development and global inclusion in Africa.
Okay, so you know how we always ask you to share interesting sources related to climate change and development?
Mm-hmm.
Well, you've given us a lot to think about this time, especially when it comes to climate information in Africa.
Yeah, it's such a critical topic, isn't it?
It really is. And today we're going to do a deep dive into why it's so hard to get the right climate information to the right people.
To the people who can actually use it effectively, make a difference, yeah.
Exactly. We're talking policymakers, farmers, businesses, everyone, really.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much effort being put into this, so many resources, so much research, but there are still huge gaps.
Huge gaps, yeah. And to really understand those gaps, we've got this fascinating policy brief. It's from the African Technology Policy Studies Network, ATPS.
Right, ATPS. And they partnered with some other big players for this project.
Oh, yeah. The Stockholm Environment Institute.
Yeah, SEI. They bring a lot of experience in environmental research to the table.
Absolutely. And then we've got the African Development Bank.
Through its ClimDev Special Fund.
ClimDev Special Fund. That's a mouthful.
It is. But it's a vital source of funding for climate initiatives across the continent.
Okay, so ATPS, SEI, AFDB, big players, big project, and they focus specifically on 5 countries.
Right. Cameroon, Kenya, Malawi, Nigeria, and Tunisia.
So what made these 5 stand out? Why were they chosen for this deep dive into climate information challenges?
Well, it was a very strategic selection process. They were looking for countries that were kind of regional hubs.
Regional hubs, okay, so influential in their respective regions.
Exactly. And then they also looked at countries that had already made some progress in developing climate policies.
So a good foundation to build on, not starting from scratch.
Right. But they also needed to be countries that are highly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change.
Because that's where the need for good climate information is most urgent.
Absolutely. And they also factored in the country's capacity for adaptation. Specifically, countries where there was a lot of room for improvement. You know, places where better information could really make a big difference.
A big difference, yeah. And I guess the ultimate goal of all this is food security, right?
That's a huge part of it. Helping these nations become more resilient to climate shocks.
Yeah.
Ensuring they can sustainably feed their people.
Exactly. And to do that, they need reliable climate information to make the right decisions. In agriculture, in infrastructure development, in everything, really.
Absolutely.
So let's talk about the core challenge here. Why is getting this information so difficult in Africa?
Well, the biggest problem is that there's still a major lack of consistent and reliable climate and weather information.
Even with all the effort being put in.
Even with all the effort, yeah. And it's not just at the national level either. It's even worse at the local level.
You mean where decisions are actually being made on the ground by farmers, local communities?
Exactly. It's about having that granular, localized data to inform those everyday decisions. And it all starts with something as basic as weather stations.
Weather stations.
Yeah. You need a dense network of weather stations to collect accurate data. But in many parts of Africa, the coverage is incredibly sparse.
Oh, wow. So there are not enough weather stations, and the ones that do exist might not be in the right places.
Right, and sometimes they're not even properly maintained. So the data they collect might not be reliable. There were studies in the early 2000s that highlighted just how bad the situation was.
So we're talking about a data gap of potentially decades.
It's a significant challenge because without accurate local data, it becomes almost impossible to develop effective early warning systems.
Early warning systems for what?
For things like droughts and floods, heat waves, extreme weather events. You need good data to predict these events and warn communities in time.
To give them a chance to prepare, to mitigate the impacts.
Exactly. And then there's agriculture. Farmers need to know the best time to plant, what crops will thrive in changing conditions.
And they need hyperlocal information for that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
They need to know what's happening on their specific plot of land. But without good data, that kind of precision is impossible. And then it goes even further than that. This lack of data means that long-term development strategies are often being made without a clear understanding of the climate risks.
Like they're building infrastructure that might be vulnerable to flooding or investing in agriculture that might not be viable in a changing climate.
Exactly. And that can have devastating consequences down the line.
So this lack of reliable data has a ripple effect across all sectors.
It really does, and it's particularly problematic because national meteorological services are often under-resourced and understaffed.
So even when they do manage to collect data, they might not have the capacity to analyze it or share it effectively.
Precisely.
It's almost like we've got this information paradox, right? On the one hand, we have this massive amount of climate information, reports, studies, projections. It's everywhere.
Yeah, it can feel overwhelming, like you're drowning in data.
But on the other hand, finding the specific actionable information that a policymaker or a farmer needs.
That's the hard part. It's like trying to find a needle in a haystack.
It is. And this report highlights that gap very clearly. The gap between the questions that decision makers are asking and the answers that are readily available.
Right. The questions are often very specific, tailored to their local context, but the available information is often too general, too high level.
So we've got a data gap in some areas and an information overload in others, but not always the right kind of information, or if it is, it's not easily discoverable.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's talk about the climate information systems themselves. What are some of the specific weaknesses that this project identified?
Well, the World Meteorological Organization, the WMO.
The WMO, right, the UN agency responsible for weather and climate.
Right. They've identified some key deficiencies in these systems globally. And these issues are very evident in the African countries, studied by ATPS.
Like what?
Well, one of the biggest issues is the lack of good atmospheric observations.
Meaning?
Meaning the monitoring networks are inadequate, there aren't enough weather stations, and the ones that do exist aren't always well maintained, so the data that's coming in might be patchy or unreliable.
So it all goes back to those weather stations. That seems to be a recurring theme.
It is a fundamental issue. And then, even if you have good data, you need a way to share it. And the communication systems in many of these countries are just not up to the task.
So we're talking about outdated technology, poor internet connectivity.
Often, yes.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's the human element. There's a real shortage of trained personnel, people who can analyze the data, interpret it, and communicate it effectively.
It sounds like a capacity issue.
It is. And then you've got things like data on land surface parameters, things like river discharge rates on lake levels.
Crucial for understanding water resources, especially in drought-prone areas.
Exactly. But that data is often missing or incomplete. And then you've got restrictive data policies.
Restrictive in what sense?
Well, sometimes governments or institutions are reluctant to share their data. They might be concerned about national security or intellectual property, but this lack of data sharing can really hinder collaboration and research. And then, of course, there's the whole issue of outdated technology, the need to digitize historical climate data.
So we're talking about paper records, handwritten logs, things that need to be converted into a digital format so they can be analyzed and used.
Exactly. And that can be a time-consuming and expensive process.
So painting a picture here, we've got National Meteorological and Hydrological Services, the NMHSs.
Right, the NMHSs.
They're facing huge challenges, lack of funding, outdated equipment, shortage of skilled staff.
Exactly. And they're the backbone of the climate information system.
Right. So how are different sectors managing with this limited information? Are some sectors doing better than others in utilizing climate information?
Well, the UNDP, the UN Development Program, has identified 8 sectors in Africa that are particularly vulnerable to climate change. And the study found that most of these sectors aren't adequately using the information that is available.
Really? That's surprising. You'd think they'd be the most motivated to use climate information to adapt and become more resilient?
You'd think so, but it's not always the case.
So which sectors are we talking about?
We're talking about agriculture, livestock, fisheries, biodiversity, water resources, energy, health, urban development, you name it.
So essential sectors for development and human well-being.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But there are a couple of interesting exceptions. The aviation sector, for example. They make very good use of climate information.
Well, yeah, I guess that makes sense. Weather is critical for flight safety.
Precisely. And then there's agriculture. There's been some good progress in using climate data for things like crop selection and irrigation, but it's still not enough to ensure food security and build resilience against climate shocks.
So there's room for improvement there. What about the health sector? How are they using climate information?
Mostly for reactive things, like early warnings for disease outbreaks linked to weather events. But proactive integration of climate data into health planning is still pretty limited.
So we're seeing a mixed bag across different sectors. Some are utilizing climate information better than others, but overall, there's a lot of untapped potential.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's break down the practical challenges a bit further. What are the biggest obstacles to actually collecting, analyzing, and disseminating climate information effectively?
Well, there are a few key challenges. One is the lack of sophisticated tools and computing power.
Meaning they don't have the technology to process and analyze large data sets.
Right. Many institutions just don't have the capacity to utilize advanced technologies like satellite data and climate modeling software.
And they might lack the funding to invest in that kind of technology.
Exactly. And then, even when they do have the data, there's the issue of downscaling.
Downscaling. That's about translating those big global climate models into more localized projections, right?
Exactly. Because global models give you a general picture, but they don't tell you what's going to happen in a specific village or district.
Which is what people on the ground need to know to make informed decisions.
Precisely. And downscaling requires specialized skills and resources that are often lacking.
So, another capacity issue.
It is. And then there's the whole issue of quality control.
Quality control of the climate information itself.
Right. There isn't really a common framework for sharing information or defining what a good quality climate service product should look like.
So you could have different organizations providing information that seems similar, but the accuracy, the level of detail, the usefulness might vary wildly.
Exactly. And that makes it difficult for users to know who to trust, what information to rely on.
So a real lack of standardization and quality assurance.
It's a problem. And then you've got the issue of scale. Yeah, different users need information at different scales. A national policymaker needs a broad overview. A farmer needs very specific, localized information.
Right, tailored to their specific needs and contexts.
Exactly. And the tools and procedures for tailoring that information are often underdeveloped.
So it all comes back to that gap between the broad, high-level data and the very specific needs on the ground.
It does. And then, of course, there's communication.
Oh, communication, right. Huge challenge.
Massive. You've got such diversity in Africa. Different cultures, different languages, different levels of literacy.
And that makes it incredibly difficult to communicate complex scientific information in a way that everyone understands and can use.
Exactly. And too often, the information is presented in very technical language, full of jargon.
So it's inaccessible to the average person, whether they're a farmer or a policymaker.
Right. And even when the language is simplified, the dissemination methods might not be effective. Well, think about it. If you're trying to reach a farmer in a rural community, sending them a scientific report in English isn't going to be very helpful.
No, not at all. They might not even be able to read English or have access to the internet to download the report.
Exactly. You need to consider the local context, the language, the culture, the available technology.
So things like community radio, mobile phone apps, more accessible, locally relevant communication channels.
Absolutely. And then, even if the information is accessible and understandable, there's still the issue of interpretation.
Interpretation.
Yeah, you often need someone to bridge the gap between the science and the practical application.
Like someone who understands both the climate data and the local farming practices. Someone who can explain to a farmer, okay, this is what the data says, and this is what it means for your crops.
Exactly. Someone like an agricultural extension agent. But these intermediaries often lack the training and support to do this effectively.
So even if the data is good and the communication is clear, the message might get lost in translation.
It happens all the time.
Okay, so we've talked about the challenges. Now let's talk about solutions. What are the key recommendations from this ATPS project? How can we bridge these information gaps and make climate information more useful?
Well, the recommendations focus on three key areas: communication, investment, and capacity building. Starting with communication, the report emphasizes that national meteorological agencies need to do a better job of tailoring their communication to the needs of different users.
So less jargon, more plain language.
Exactly. And they need to be more proactive about engaging with users, finding out what information they need and how they want to receive it.
It's about two-way communication, not just a one-way flow of information.
Precisely. And then the whole process of generating and communicating climate information needs to be more integrated with development processes. Meaning that climate information should be embedded in sectoral development plans, in policy decisions, in project implementation. It needs to be part of the conversation from the very beginning.
So not just an afterthought, it needs to be front and center.
Exactly. And the report also recommends that governments create an enabling environment for partnerships and networks.
To facilitate data sharing, collaboration, and more coordinated communication.
Right. And NMHSs should play a more active role in bringing together scientists, policymakers, and practitioners.
To break down those silos to foster dialogue and knowledge sharing.
Exactly. And a really important point that they make is about the social value of climate information.
Social value.
Yeah. They're saying that anyone communicating climate science needs to be aware of the broader social and political context. They need to understand the goals and priorities of policymakers and communicate in a way that respects those goals.
So building trust, building relationships, being sensitive to the political realities.
Absolutely. And ultimately, it all comes down to making the information user-friendly.
User-friendly. That seems to be a key theme throughout this report.
It is. It's about providing information in the right language, at the right scale, in the right format for the people who need to use it.
So if you're talking to a farmer, you might use visual aids, storytelling, or even traditional knowledge systems to help them understand the information.
Exactly. It's about making it relevant and relatable.
Okay, so that's communication. What about investment? Where do we need to be putting more resources?
Well, the report argues that investing in climate information is not just about mitigating risk. It's about creating opportunity.
Opportunities.
Yeah, because when you have good climate information, you can make better decisions about investments. You can identify new markets, new products, new ways of doing things that are adapted to a changing climate.
So it's not just about avoiding losses, it's about finding new ways to thrive.
Exactly. And governments need to play a role here. They need to create policies and incentives that encourage all sectors to incorporate climate information into their planning and decision-making.
To mainstream climate considerations across all sectors, not just those that are traditionally seen as climate sensitive.
Right. And that brings us to the third key area, capacity building.
Capacity building. That's about building the skills and resources to effectively utilize climate information, right?
Exactly. And it's about building foresight, the ability to anticipate and adapt to future changes.
And that's where tools like scenario planning come in.
Right. Scenario planning helps us explore different possible futures and develop strategies that are robust to a range of climate impacts.
So it's not just about reacting to what's happening now, it's about being prepared for what might happen in the future.
Exactly. And the report recommends that governments invest in capacity building at all levels, within the NMHSs, within other government agencies, and within communities.
So training people in data analysis, climate modeling, communication, foresight.
Right. And also investing in the technology and infrastructure that they need to do their jobs effectively.
So it's a multi-pronged approach.
It is. And it requires long-term commitment and sustained investment.
So we've covered a lot of ground here, the challenges, the potential solutions. It really highlights the complexity of this issue.
It does. And the report really drives home the point that simply having climate data is not enough. It needs to be the right data, presented in the right way, to the right people, at the right time.
And those people need to have the capacity to understand it and use it.
Exactly. It's about transforming data into knowledge, and then transforming that knowledge into action.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, it really makes you think about the interconnectedness of climate change, development, and individual livelihoods in Africa.
It does, and it makes you think about the role that we can all play in bridging these information gaps and supporting more effective use of climate information.
It does, and maybe that starts with learning more about the work of organizations like ATPS and their partners.
Absolutely.
So for all of you listening, I encourage you to check out their website and really think about how you, in your own way, can contribute to this critically important effort.
It's an effort that affects us all.
It does. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching. Join us every Thursday for more insightful conversations.